Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Sama, Sisters Against Mental Abuse. I'm your host, Misty, and today we have the hostess of the MisogynoirMurders Podcast. Welcome, Ronnetta Rideout. How are you?
I'm well, thank you so much for having me. How are you?
I'm good. I'm super excited. I know that you're super busy and you've got a lot going on, so I can't thank you enough for coming on today and speaking with me.
Well, thank you for convincing me.
So I guess we'll just dive right in because I have questions that I want to know personally. I know that your podcast, Misogynoir Murders, just made its 1 year anniversary. So congratulations. I know that's a big achievement
Yes,
doing this
thank
all
you.
doing it all by yourself. So can you tell us a little bit about Misogynoir Murders? Can you tell us what made you start it? And then also maybe first, could you tell us what misogynoir is, in case people don't know?
Yes. A lot of people ask that. So, and it's a totally fair question. So misogynoir is a word that was coined by a feminist and activist named Moya Bailey. She's Black, and this happened back in 2010. And it's something that sort of surfaced on Twitter, and you know, it became the word, right? Those trendy catchphrases, it became one of those. And it essentially means the intersection between racism and misogyny. In simpler terms, it's the dislike of or contempt for Black women. And so that's misogynoir. And I named my podcast that because as a person with a name with, alliteration, Ronnetta Rideout, I like the MisogynoirMurders. It sounded good. And it really just sort of lets the listener know without even listening what this is about, who's going to be centered. It's not going to be anyone but Black women ever. And that's sort of the hill that I'm willing to die on. And I started this podcast because one, I'm a huge true crime, aficionado, which I feel kind of mixed. I have mixed feelings about even saying something like that. But I've always been someone who always watched true crime shows and, all the murder mystery fictional shows. Like I've always been into that. But during the pandemic, I started listening to Crime Junkie. I was brand new to listening to podcasts, and I started listening to that. And first of all, love that show. And Ashley Flowers really inspired me to start my own podcast because while Crime Junkie does do a pretty decent job of being inclusive about the stories that they tell on their platform, there really wasn't anything that I knew of at the time that told the stories of missing and murdered Black women and girls in that type of format, with the same type of advocacy and messaging behind it. And so that's what really inspired me to start my own podcast and start utilizing some of the skills and interests that I already have, and putting it to use for the greater good. I'm a mother to a teenage daughter. So I always think every time I tell one of these stories, I picture my friend or my daughter or my mother or my aunt or, some Black woman or girl that I know in the place of these women whose stories I'm telling, and who would look for them, who would try to solve their cases, who would raise awareness about what happened to them. We see too much of that and there's not a lot of coverage. So I just felt compelled to do what I could to help in some small way.
Oh wow, okay. Yeah, so I think I think we're very similar in being true crime junkies, but I'm addicted to investigation discovery. I listen to the Dateline podcast, all of that stuff, and it's fascinating. And I understand you're saying it's kind of weird to say it because it's we're admitting that we're fascinated by murder, but it's still it's like, what makes this person do this? Like,
Mm.
what can we learn about it? I mean, there's a whole field dedicated to like understanding the mind of people that commit murders and everything like that. So I definitely understand like being conflicted at the same time, because I don't know how you do what you do. Here and there, I cover a few stories of Black women that have been mentally abused and murdered, and it wears on you, doesn't it? It's
It
wow.
does. I, yeah, I have said on my podcast that I cry at some point during every single production. Every episode brings tears to my eyes. Even just saying that, my eyes are already welling, um,
Yeah.
because these are real lives that were viciously, violently, brutally, unexpectedly just taken, and the carnage left behind. I do cry during each episode at some point, um, just because these were real people. And here I am, some stranger who doesn't know them from anything, telling their story. So, there's all this pressure to do a good job, first of all, in their honor. Um, but two, it's like, I kind of like imagine them there, like next to me.
Mhm.
And that makes me sad. So I'll cry about that. I actually have an altar in my house that I visit, and sometimes I will go over there and I'll say their names and, just talk to their soul, their spirit, just because that helps me to feel better about this. But you're right, it's all sad, and it's the doing of the podcast that kind of got me out of, true crime as an interest. Even though I still, obsess with, along with everyone else with on the ID channel. And I watch everything that is ever out about, these horrible stories. But, like you said, when I see a Black face, it hurts a little bit more. But I have to be honest, all the stories really do get into my heart. But these stories about these women and girls, so many of them are unknown outside of their own communities. So while it is sad, I consider it to be an honor to be able to tell their stories in a way that I would hope would make them proud and humanizes them in the eyes of the people who are listening.
Yeah, yeah, I feel that. I feel like they don't get a lot of coverage, and you're helping to get their stories out there. I mean, because we all hear about, the white girls that are, something happens to them or they go missing, but it feels like, you know, maybe this happens to us so often that no one cares. I mean, that I don't think that that's the reality. I hope that's not the reality, but that's how it feels. Because a lot of these stories, they happen so often. I was going to ask you about a little bit more about like what you see in your research. And specifically over here we cover mental abuse, and I firmly believe that most times there is mental abuse, whether we miss the red flags or not. I think that there's also data that suggests, like, in an overwhelming amount of these domestic violence or homicide situations, there is mental abuse. So, do you see this pattern when you were doing the research? Could you share some of those stories with us where you saw mental abuse as a part of the unfortunate ending of some of these lives?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are a lot of those stories. Most of the stories I've told on my podcast actually center, or I should say, include intimate partner violence or abuse in the home. Um, and almost all of those stories, it began with the emotional and mental abuse. Some person telling the victim that they're not pretty, or they they need this abuser, that they're not going to ever be anything without them, that they can't survive without them. that they can't do as good of a job without the burden of the abuser. So I see that a lot. And in so many cases, like in the case of Destiny Smothers, she was the very first person that I told on my podcast. And she had been abused for 13 years. This had been her boyfriend since she was younger than my daughter. And they had 2 children together. And this man abused her top to bottom, mentally, emotionally, and physically. And ultimately, he now stands accused for having killed her. And there's so much of that. And the statistics prove it. Black women are much more likely to meet an abusive and violent and in an abusive relationship than white women and any other demographic besides Indigenous and Native women. So we come in number 2, and that's pretty horrible, pretty scary.
Yeah.
And so it just indicates how prevalent this is in our community.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And so when I first started Sama, it was more so um, connecting victims of domestic violence with the right shelters. That's a whole long story, but that's how it kind of started out. And there were a lot of like women that were on tribal land that needed help getting connected with, like a local shelter or something like that. And I noticed that there were, quite a few. And I don't know much about tribal law, but it seemed like that was one of the factors that affected them as well. It's like location and what they had access to and everything like that. So I've also read that statistic, and I can see it. I want to take it back. So when you started MisogynoirMurders, what kind of feedback did you get, especially from then to now? What's been like the reception of your podcast? I know that I spoke with Rosa from Black Femicide, and she told me that she gets death threats for even bringing attention to the Black femicide rate. So, what's been your feedback from people?
Thankfully, feedback for me and the podcast has been really, really, really positive. I have not received, knock on wood, let me knock right now, shoot. I haven't received any negative feedback at
Okay,
all.
good.
But I do follow Black Femicide. In fact, I am a huge fan of Rosa's. Many of the cases that I've covered, I've found these names because of the work that she has done. I've mentioned Black Femicide so many times in my podcast in my podcast episodes, because, she's out here doing the work. But as someone who follows, I can totally see why she's receiving that type of, engagement versus why I'm not receiving that type of engagement.
Well, why do you wait? What what are you seeing? Because I don't see. I mean, to me, it doesn't make sense at all. So what are you seeing? Because I feel like both of you are bringing awareness to something that's really important that would otherwise be ignored. So I guess I don't understand.
I mean, don't get me wrong. There's no justification for it. None at all. Like, no one should be threatening anyone. And I certainly don't think that she deserves that. But she's much more pointed in her delivery because her mission is to educate us and to protect us. Whereas my mission is to raise awareness and to get people engaged in, a call of action. But she is trying to protect us. And in trying to do so, it opens the door for all of the abusers to now have a face or a name or an alias to attack. And plus, it's the internet, right? If she's, pointing out the facts like she does, and a lot of these folks, most of the time, the ones that I see, they're all men. They come onto her page harassing her because they don't like what she said. To me, I can understand why they're coming, because she's out there in that way. Whereas for me, it's very passive. She's active. She's holding marches. She's putting a name to it. What is her hashtag? Call it what it is. I can't remember exactly what the hashtag is, something to that effect, but like put a name to it. She wants people to recognize the abuse and where it's coming from. Who is actually killing all these Black women and girls? Who's the one? Who are the groups of people that are taking them and sex trafficking them more than anybody else? And we can't be blind to the fact that is, that demographic happens to be Black men. I didn't make the rules. I didn't come up with the statistics, and neither did she. But she's calling them out, right? She's saying that all the time, never lets up. So I can kind of see why they're coming out the woodwork, because she's there and available. Me, they have to actually listen to my podcast, kind of get a feel. And I don't really come directly at the situation in the same way. So it's sort of, that's why, to me, this is just, from my perception. But, as a fan and someone who admires the work that she and her people do, I hope and pray that she never lets up. And I pray that she continues to be, as outspoken and unrelenting as she has been, because we need it.
Oh yeah. Yeah. You know what? But when I spoke to her, she didn't say that it was just Black men. She said there's Black women too, also
Oh, for sure.
threatening her. And but
Girl,
that's
the pick-me's. The pick-me's are always going to be there. The pick-me's want to be picked. Okay.
yeah.
So they're latching on. But, in all of this, and what she does and what I do, what you're doing, the bigger thing here is patriarchy. That's all that I see. And any time that you come for that establishment, that institution, that system, trust and believe the men are going to come for your throat, but their pick-me ass women are going to come. Excuse my French, but I mean, it simply is what it is. So I'm not surprised in the least bit, because I see on these threads, the women bother me more than the men, because I expect that from the men. I don't expect that from my sister, the one who's here in the trenches, the one who is also impacted by this system and institution of patriarchy. It really throws me for a loop. So while it's not just men, it is the women too. It's still linked to the same issue, which is patriarchy. So I just kind of group them all together. But, it's unfortunate that she's even living through that. And yet she's still out here putting in the work. And, I got to give her flowers every time I give her flowers.
On the topic of Rosa from Black Femicide, do you think that when we talk about these things that we should stay anonymous? I'm kind of struggling with that myself. I am going to be anonymous for now. But what's your take on that? I personally think that Rosa should have stayed anonymous, because I feel so bad, because now she's getting attacked and people know her name and they know what she looks like and everything. Do you think that we should be anonymous when we're covering things like this?
I mean, I think it's a personal preference. I don't know if there is a should answer, right? Like, if you feel comfortable being anonymous, then you do your work and be anonymous. You can be just as effective as someone who puts their name out there. For me, I really struggled with this as well. With a name like Ronnetta Rideout, there are not many of us, very easy to find me, even though I do take a lot of precautions, one of which is called onerep.com. Listen, I swear by that. It scrubs the internet for all your personal information and removes it for you. I live with that and I recommend it for everyone. So I've taken whatever precautions I can to make myself feel comfortable by putting my name out there, but I still haven't put my face out there, haven't put any pictures or done any videos, even though I think that I will pretty soon, actually. But I really had to get a feel, because like you said, like, as a follower of Rosa's, I've seen firsthand what exactly she deals with. And I didn't want to experience that. So, I was a lot less brave than she is.
Oh
That's
yeah.
why I said you got to give her flowers, because part of doing the work is being vulnerable in that visibility. And she's doing that.
Yes.
She's leading the charge in that. She's putting her face and her life out there. I was way more passive in my approach, because I was like, I'm just gonna lean into this real gently to see, test the waters. And so I'm feeling comfortable now where I want to put my face out there more. But you know, it's a personal choice.
So I want to ask also, what kind of advice, like you look at this stuff day in, day out, you read these stories, you have to dig in deeper than, most people probably would. I mean, because a lot of these are headlines, if that, so you have to go in and get the background. What kind of advice do you have for other Black women that might end up in a situation that might be scary, or um, see themselves there with a partner that may be mentally abusive or verbally abusive or anything of the like? What kind of advice do you have for those women?
Tell your friends and family, and start looking into what options you have outside of your personal support system. Because what I have come to learn is that 20% of homicides, when it comes to domestic abuse type situations or domestically violent relationships, 20% of the people who are killed are not in the couple. So those are, friends and family and coworkers who have gone out of their way to be supportive of, the victim, their loved one. um, so I think that it's important for people to know that you should absolutely confide in your personal connections, but there are professionals, organizations out there that are built on the foundation of understanding what the abuse cycle is like, what these victims, male or female, are going through, and how they can overcome some of those challenges. So they're professionals. So I recommend reaching out to those networks and begin formulating your plan on how to exit, because leaving is the most dangerous time. It is not easy, like everyone seems to believe. Everyone has this idea that, oh, I wouldn't deal with that, I'm just going to leave. Well, no, most people don't even realize that they're being emotionally or mentally manipulated or abused. One. Two, by the time they do realize it, there's usually a physical component now added in. So it really just isn't that easy. So I think, talking to friends and family is good, but most importantly, reach out to those outside professionals for help.
Okay. I want to ask another question, and it's okay if you don't know this off the top of your head, but like when you're doing this research about, I guess, what percentage of these incidents happen after the breakup or after the woman is about to leave?
I cannot remember the exact number, but it was something high. I want to say it was over half, over 50%. And if not over, maybe like a little beneath. I can't remember the exact statistic, but the long and short of it is, statistically, it is very, very, very dangerous when the victim has decided to leave or they have left, which is
Mhm.
why, I say reach out to those outside communities, because, your abuser knows who your mom is, who your grandma is, and your aunts, uncles, where your friends are, right? So where are you going to go? You need someplace outside of that network. Um, in order, at least in my opinion, in order to have a shot at escaping it.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen that as well. So I I don't want to keep you any longer. Could you share your socials with us? I didn't know you had a Facebook until today. Um, you- but please do. I mean, how can we find you?
I am on all of the podcast listening platforms. So you can find me on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, so many of them I can't even remember. And as far as the socials go, I think Instagram is probably the only social media account that I actively will take a peek at. And I'm not so good at that, but you can find me at MisogynoirMurders there. Um, People do love to DM me though. So many of the cases that I have covered have come from listeners in all different parts of the country. And even I've had people from other parts of the world reach out wanting me to cover a story. Um, so you can always DM me or you can email me at info@misogynoirmurders.com.
It was so great to have you on. We got to do this again because I definitely want to stay updated with what you have going. I know you said that it's a lot to process and to work on, and I'm sure it's very mentally draining. But I definitely want to have you on for an update sometime soon. If you could, if you would like to.
Yes. Yes. No, I totally love chatting with you. Thank you for convincing me to come on. Thank you for sharing your audience with me. And I appreciate what you're trying to do for the community because, if one of us suffers, we all suffer, every single one of us. So thank you for what you're doing.
Likewise, thank you. And that concludes our episode for today. Thank you for joining us. If you are a Black woman who has a story to share about mental abuse, whether with family, romantic partner, friendship, or you are a Black woman in the mental health field, please reach out to us, samatogethernow@gmail.com. We are on Facebook as Sisters Against Mental Abuse, and we are also on Instagram at samatogethernow. Thank you for joining us, and remember, mental abuse is abuse.